must toll the 2 bells of ascension. Then find the soul vessel that will let you commune with the dead. No, just smash the source with a rock. Or your head, either will do.
Well, I'll say one thing for Death's Gambit. It's not exactly subtle about its influences. This may very well be the Dark Souls of Dark Souls copycats. It wants to be Dark Souls so much that it may in fact desire to be Dark Souls more than Dark Souls itself does. The character creation menu alone is amazing. If you squint, you may be fooled into believing that From Software made this screen themselves. But Death's Gambit isn't really trying to fool anyone. It knows full well that you know full well that it knows full well what it's doing. It's not above poking fun at itself for trying to be Dark Souls, and the resulting game is okay. It's alright, suffering mostly from coming out during an absolute bonanza of similar styled games, chiefly among them Dead Cells, which Death's Gambit unfortunately just can't quite stack up against. So it's yet another 2D hardcore action platformer. It's got a methodical combat system governed by a stamina meter, which we'll fucking talk about. It boasts a dark story about a deal with death, hence the name Death's Gambit, with splashes of humour thrown in here and there, and dialogue with NPCs that again quite mimics Dark Souls. Everybody's a bit obscure and weird when you talk to them. Boss fights are huge and impressive encounters. The enemy designs and animations are fantastic to boot. Plus there's a really good soundtrack at play. A soundtrack that, and you know, we might as well just take this as read by now, a soundtrack that mimics the Dark Souls sound, but certainly isn't bad as a result. Unfortunately, you've got to be kinda careful when you try and take the Dark Souls formula and put it into a 2D space, because you do not have the same freedom of movement to make the same kind of tactical decisions, especially when you decide to throw a stamina meter in there. And Death's Gambit's made the mistake of putting far too much emphasis on the stamina meter and honestly not giving you enough endurance to effectively dodge and block and attack, especially when there's nowhere to retreat to effectively, which is notable during boss fights where the space is even more restricted. If you pick a character class with a low endurance to start with, then you're going to be in for a rough time, and even if you don't, the stamina meter is so harsh that you're going to want to level up and put as much as you can into endurance to raise it. It got to the point where I was fighting bosses and really did not feel like I had enough of a stamina meter to deal with them. Their attacks were far-ranging, you had to dodge multiple times to get out of the way of them, and by the time you got free and got back, you just didn't have enough to hit them with. And they, of course, are under no such restriction. A methodical, slow, thoughtful approach to attacking is obviously emphasised with this, but counterproductively, you still have to move really quickly. This is one of those games, one of those many games, where I feel the stamina meter does not add to the experience whatsoever. It feels like it's in here because it's in Dark Souls, and that's all the justification one needs to put it in a game. But again, Dark Souls has that freedom of movement, Dark Souls does emphasise a slow, methodical approach, and more importantly, it gives you enough stamina to work with. On top of that, Death's Gambit, and I keep trying not to accidentally say Dark Souls here, Death's Gambit suffers from not being quite as responsive or as fluid as it should be. The character controls a little stodgily, a little awkwardly, and sometimes it feels like they're just not responding quickly enough to your commands. Going from Dead Cells to this is a little bit tough, because Dead Cells is the opposite. It's really fluid, it's really responsive. It feels immediate and therefore superb to play. I understand, of course, that this game wants to be Dark Souls really, really badly, but it could have stood to have not aped the formula quite so much, because this is a 2D hardcore action platformer and therefore really benefits from being a bit more like a game such as Dead Cells than a game like Dark Souls. And I bloody well know during this video I'm going to inevitably mix up these fucking names, but as far as being an atmospheric, suitably moody action platformer that feels good to play when it does all work and come together, Death's Gambit is okay. I don't think it's an outstanding game, but I don't think it's particularly bad either. The elements it successfully takes from Dark Souls are presented nicely here. Interestingly, rather than lose souls, I'm just going to call them souls, when you die, you lose healing items. You have to go and pick those back up wherever you died last. which adds a unique challenge to the experience, and you can spend your souls to recall those items if you don't want to fight all the way there again. Your character has stats that very closely mimic those found in Dark Souls. You've got your strength for strength scaling weapons, you've got finesse for finesse scaling weapons, that's your dexterity. You can be a warrior or a wizard or a death acolyte, and each character class has access to powerful and fun to use skills and abilities and spells and whatnot. There's plenty of loot to pick up, gear to put onto your character. The stock and trade enemies are fun to fight and pretty damn challenging in their own right sometimes. And you get a horse. You can ride a horse between levels and smash enemies over, and the horse looks really cool and it's a good horse, and the horse should be in the game more often and the game should be about the horse. Death's Gambit is a charming game that wears its Dark Souls on its sleeve, and I think there's going to be an audience for this game that truly loves it and can't get enough of what it does. For yours truly, I don't think I've got the patience to see this one through, and it didn't take me long to go back to Dead Cells or start looking into that Chasm game. And God, we got other 2D hardcore action games on the horizon. We've got Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. Apparently this is the sort of game that's in vogue this season, and that's fine because I really like them, so bring them on. But with so many out there, you're gonna have to be exceptional to really stand out, and for me, Death's Gambit just isn't exceptional. It is decent though, and fans of this sort of game are likely to have a pretty fun time with this one. But as for me, I've put time into it, I'm happy with what I've played, but I don't need to play any more, not with what I already have in my library, and not with what's coming out. And really, just fuck stamina meters in 90% of games.